quiz. Ready? What is the biggest country in the Middle East? And I don't mean the biggest by land area. You don't get credit for large swaths of territory that are uninhabited, Saudi Arabia. No, I mean, what is the biggest nation in the Middle East by population? Turns out it is not at all a close call. It is Egypt, by a lot. More than 1 in 5 people in the whole Middle East is Egyptian. It is not the richest country. It is not geographically right in the middle. It is not sprawled out the furthest over the most land area. But it is the center of gravity for both population and the politics of that whole blessed region. Geographically, more toward the actual middle of the whole Middle East is the nation of Israel, comparatively tiny, right? And if you want to understand where this past week's worth of fighting is centered, you have to zoom in even further to a whole different scale to even be able to see what the relevant border is over which this fighting is happening. And looking at it in that context, you might reasonably ask, hey, what's that giant border right next to this relatively tiny place that is being fought over? That is Egypt, right there. That's the Egyptian border right up against and immediately next to this tiny strip of land where the fighting is happening in Gaza. And that is part of why this was such a big deal. Egypt and Israel shaking hands. Thank you, Jimmy Carter. The peace treaty between this hugely important country, the center of gravity in the Middle East, and the nation of Israel. But Jimmy Carter, it turns out, is not only the only live American historical connection to this critically important relationship that you see diagrammed there. The president of Egypt, who in this picture is shaking hands with the prime minister of Israel and sealing this historic peace treaty between these two countries. This president of Egypt is Anwar Sadat. That handshake was in March of 1979. 2.5 years later, Anwar Sadat was assassinated. How did he come to be assassinated? Well, a fatwa calling for the assassination came from this guy. And this guy right now is in prison in the United States, in a federal prison complex in North Carolina, thanks to his role in the first bombing of the World Trade Center back in the 90s. And after this guy called for the assassination of President Sadat in Egypt, who had made that huge peace deal with Israel, after Sadat was killed, who succeeded him? Who came after him? Who was the next president? This guy, Hosni Mubarak, who then ran Egypt with an iron fist for nearly 30 years, and who kept that deal with Israel. For all of the chaos and upheaval and injustice and violence and multiple repetitive wars and endless going nowhere negotiations and turnover and turmoil, from Anwar Sadat in 1979 through Hosni Mubarak for 30 plus years, that peace agreement between Egypt and Israel was in a region where almost nothing seems knowable. It was a knowable thing in the Middle East. The country that is the most populous nation in the region, the center of gravity for the whole Arab world, in a peace treaty with Israel. And then all of a sudden, very recently, that knowable thing for a generation, that knowable thing about that part of the world, suddenly became no longer a knowable thing. Because in February of last year, the Arab Spring Revolution in Egypt ousted Hosni Mubarak from power after 30 years and replaced him, ultimately, with a guy who is a whole new ball of wax. President Mohammed Morsi comes from the Muslim Brotherhood. And whatever that means for the future of Egypt and how it will be governed and the hopes and prospects for the Egyptian people, whatever that means inside Egypt, there is also this question of whether or not Egypt now, after 30 plus years of standing for this unlikely peace with Israel, is going to continue to do that. And yeah, on the one hand, news like what we've been hearing for the past week out of Gaza may sound like an old record that is skipping, and you're back to a song that you have heard before. I mean, yeah, when Condoleezza Rice was on her way out as Secretary of State, wasn't she trying to negotiate a ceasefire between Israelis and Palestinians in a war in Gaza? Didn't that just happen? Didn't this just happen all over again? Yes, this did just happen. It happened in January of 2009 at the very end of the Bush administration. But even though at the surface level, this sounds the same, right? Even though this sounds the same at a distance, it is really important that that was a different world then. That was a pre-Arab Spring world. And today, with America's current Secretary of State, Hillary Clinton, jetting over to the region for a middle-of-the-night meeting, right? It is new and newly important and ultimately fascinating that where our Secretary of State is going to end up is in Egypt. Because Egypt is right in the middle of it, right? Egypt is at the heart of these efforts going on right now to try to negotiate a ceasefire. That ceasefire was hoped for today. It did not happen today, but the parts are in motion. You've seen over the last few days where Hillary Clinton has been in the world and how quickly plans changed, right? I mean, at 11:15 p.m. Eastern Time on Sunday, this was her with President Obama meeting with the president of Burma. As of 12:47 a.m. yesterday, here she was with the president at the home of the pro-democracy activist Aung San Suu Kyi in Burma. As of 4:14 p.m. yesterday, she was boarding Air Force One with the president headed to Cambodia. As of midnight today, she was with the president at the East Asia Summit in Cambodia. But then Hillary Clinton suddenly and unexpectedly peeled off, leaving Cambodia at 2:51 Eastern Time this afternoon, flying first to Israel so she could make a middle-of-the-night meeting with Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu in Jerusalem. This took place local time at 11:08 p.m. in Jerusalem, when Hillary Clinton sat down with Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. And from there, after her meeting with the Israeli Prime Minister, she went to go talk to the Palestinians. But not the Palestinians in Gaza, where the fighting is happening, because the U.S. does not talk to their governing body, which is Hamas. The U.S. doesn't talk to them. So instead, Hillary Clinton will go to a totally different Palestinian-controlled territory that is not geographically contiguous with where the fighting is in Gaza. She will be taking off from Israel for the West Bank. And yes, as long as we're talking about confusing things, yes, the West Bank is east of the other place that we're talking about. It's confusing, but there it is. So it's Israel first, and then the Palestinian Authority. And then where does she go after that? To be part of the international negotiations that are happening on this ceasefire in this critical part of the world? She's going to Cairo, to Egypt, because everybody is counting on them. They are indispensable. The president himself is finishing his whirlwind 4-day trip, not in the Middle East, but in the Far East, and he has kept up his intensive schedule of public events and appearances there. But he has also been doing some of his diplomacy personally. The New York Times reporting that the president spent last night up until 2:30 in the morning making multiple one-on-one direct phone calls with the Israeli prime minister. And also, not the head of Hamas, not the Palestinian Authority, but the president of Egypt, which for a generation was our steadfast ally in the region, even though it was a creepy and repressive dictatorship. Now that country, that center of gravity, that crucial nation in this critical part of the world, has a whole new face and maybe a whole new character in terms of its international responsibilities. And nobody knows if this effort by them to broker a ceasefire is going to work. But it seems almost as important for the region, for the world, for us, frankly, that if a ceasefire is going to come from anywhere, it looks like it's going to come from there. Joining us now live from Gaza is Richard Engel, NBC's chief foreign correspondent. Richard, earlier today we were hearing reports out of Jerusalem that a ceasefire might be possible by tonight. That did not happen. What did happen today? Why did those prospects change?
I think it goes back to what you were just talking about. The historic picture has changed here, and the two sides basically didn't want the ceasefire. Thinks it has a very strong hand right now. Hamas, for decades, really, before Hamas was Hamas, it was the Muslim Brotherhood, has region. When Hamas came to power in Gaza, President Mubarak treated it like a criminal organization. Now, today, you had 13 Arab foreign ministers coming to Gaza, visiting the Hamas leader, and the Hamas leader, Ismail, has often had to run around the world as if he was a terrorist, now is receiving all of these Arab dignitaries. He feels like he's in a very strong... The Hamas position is that there should be a ceasefire immediately, and that along with that ceasefire, there should be an open, what Gazans call the closure or the siege on Gaza. Because I'm glad you showed that map earlier. You see that Gaza doesn't have any external borders surrounded by Egypt or by Israel. And according to various internationally brokered agreements, any goods that come in or out of subject to very severe restrictions, and the people of Gaza can't leave unless they are also given specific security agreements. So what Hamas is asking for is immediate change of all of that status, a lifting of the blockade, making it possible for the people of Gaza to export what they want, to travel as they want, and to have that coincide at the same time as a ceasefire. Israel doesn't want to do that. tear up the old agreements that it says are necessary to restrict the flow of goods into Gaza, to restrict the flow of weapons. Israel believes that if you allow more products to come into Gaza, there will be more weapons just coming in, and Israel is positioned thus far. Stop firing rockets, and then to end relations with Hamas about some of these other things, travel restrictions and the trade restrictions.
Richard, we're having a little trouble with your uplink in terms of you jumping sort of in and out of your connection, but let me just take a risk and ask you one more question here, which is about Secretary of State Hillary Clinton arriving in the region. What are the best sort of hopes and expectations for what she's going to be able to do? Do you think she's actually going to change anything in terms of the balance of power and how likely this is to be resolved?
It depends if she can convince the Egyptians to convince Hamas. It now feels very confident because the Arab Spring has given it a new batch of friends. If Hillary Clinton can pressure Hamas and who can be persuaded by Mohammed Morsi, her chances are pretty good. If she cannot, then I think this will another round of fighting, potentially even a ground war. I don't think Israel wants a ground war. I don't think Hamas would mind a ground war. Into a much more bloody situation. Would it get involved? Not the Egyptian government, the Egyptian people would start streaming in here. The Arab media that was so influential in bringing down Arab dictatorships here would go into a state of, and that would benefit Hamas. So I think it really depends on how much influence the Hillary Clinton can have over Morsi and how much influence Morsi can have over. Because even though this area here is being pounded militarily, and there was the heaviest airstrikes tonight that we have seen thus far, Hamas feels it's fair.
Richard Engel, NBC's chief foreign correspondent, live from Gaza. Richard, thank you. Thank you for staying up into the middle of the night. Stay safe tonight, man. Thank you. You know, thinking about the overall leverage here that the American government has, we all judge our diplomacy of our own government based on what outcome they're able to achieve. But in a case like this in particular, the thing that we can do is apply pressure, American pressure, to a lever and hope that lever can affect the situation on the ground. And the lever that we can apply here is Egypt. And boy, has Egypt changed a lot in the past year. And knowing what that relationship is going to be like between us and them and the rest of the world is one of the great unknowns in the question of world peace. It's uncertain times. All right.